Professor Szpiech is currently writing a book on narratives of religious conversion and their function within polemical writing in the 12th to the 15th centuries. And he's also studying the use of Islam as hermeneutic device by Christians in 14th century anti-Jewish polemic. And I think that this is what we're going to hear about, part of what we're going to hear about today.
No, that's on Monday.
Well, that's on Monday.
If you're interested.
FYI. What we're going to hear today is Latin against Hebrew, Latin against Arabic, linguistic authority in the medieval Mediterranean.
Thanks, Carla. This talk is drawn from material that I've gathered while preparing a chapter on Latin as a language of authority for a forthcoming volume, a handbook on Latin from Oxford University Press. So if you're interested in any of the details of what I'm going to say, the specific original languages, the page numbers, I can send you the original text, which has much more in it if you're interested. So just email me. It's just my last name at umich.edu. According to the 13th century Italian Franciscan writer Salimbene de Adam, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II of Sicily, who was one of the most powerful rulers of the Middle Ages and a great patron of translation of Greek and Arabic books, once conducted a very dangerous and troubling experiment. Frederick, Salimbene said, wanted very much to determine if children had an inborn or innate ability in language, and if so, which one would be their inborn language. So, Salimbene tells us, he wanted to discover which sort of language and speech a child would have if he grew up without anyone speaking to him. Therefore, he placed some infants in the care of wet nurses, commanding them to bathe and suckle the children, but by no means ever to speak to or fondle them. He wanted to discover whether they would speak Hebrew, which was the first language, or Greek, or Latin, or Arabic, or some language of their parents from whom they were born. But, as you can imagine, this didn't turn out well. He labored in vain because all the infants died. Despite the tragic outcome of this little story, we should pause to consider Frederick's motives here in a little more detail. We can ask first, why was the question of an inborn first language so important? So important that it could impel him to take on this ill-fated venture. Second, why does the text of Salimbene suggest that Greek or Latin or Arabic, altogether as possibilities, might be one of their original languages? And why does it not name other languages, also popular at the time, like French, or English, or even some Germanic language? And third, why is Hebrew given the first place among these languages as possibly the first or mother of all languages, especially given that the children and the parents were not Jewish? So in the discussion that follows over the next half hour or 40 minutes or so, I want to use Frederick's admittedly very troubled curiosity as a window onto a few medieval ideas about language and writing. Since Salimbene was writing his account in Latin, I specifically want to consider Latin and its relation, both within and beyond Western Christendom, to the other languages mentioned in this text, to Greek and Arabic and Hebrew, and we can't forget, to these unnamed spoken languages of these poor bereft parents. How did medieval Latin measure up against these other languages? The first place to start in a discussion about the status of Latin as a language in the Middle Ages is at the very beginning, at the end of the 4th century, the very eve of the sacking of Rome in 410 by the German Visigoths, an event that precipitated the collapse of the Roman government and the very moment at which the Latin version of the Christian Bible, the so-called Vulgate Bible, was being established and canonized. These two formative events, the sacking of Rome and the formation of the Christian canon in Latin, overlapped and converged in the work of the great 5th century Roman Catholic bishop, Augustine of Hippo. He was a man who thought as much about the fall of Rome as he did about the value of the Latin language and the nature of Christian scriptures. In his 5th century work, written over 2 decades that followed the fall of Rome, Augustine maintained a strident epistolary debate with his contemporary, the Hebrew and Greek linguist St. Jerome, over the latter's project to translate scripture directly from Hebrew. Against Jerome, Augustine duked it out, maintaining that the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, made in Alexandria in the 3rd to 2nd century BCE, should be the authoritative source for Jerome's Latin translation, rather than the Hebrew original. He argued this against Jerome because he said the authority of the Greek Septuagint derived from a faith that reflected the miraculous product of 70 men writing in unison by God's grace, a unison that stood in very stark contrast to what he called the infinite variety of Latin translations and versions. So despite Augustine's appeal, it was actually Jerome's Latin version of the Hebrew Bible that eventually came to represent the standard scripture for medieval Western Christianity. How did this really happen? Although the Latin language per se was not a vehicle of original revelation, the Old Testament was not authoritative in either in Latin or in any other language except Greek or maybe Hebrew. The New Testament was only authoritative in Greek. How did Latin come to be the dominant language of the Bible and represent an inheritance of these other laws of God? It was, just as the Septuagint represented for Augustine, elevated to stand on equal or higher prophetic footing with its forebears. The authority of the Latin language in the Middle Ages stemmed from its own status as an inheritor, not a founder, but an inheritor of earlier authority. And it was so in three distinct but intersecting senses, which I want to explore today. As the language of Rome and its empire, implying also the apostolic succession of the Church of Rome. As the language of learning and of wisdom, first as embodied in a standard canon of authors, and later as a rival to Arabic, in texts inherited from Greece through Arabic translation. And finally, as one of God's three holy languages, a language on the cross in competition with Hebrew and with Greek. Authoritative as both a source and, more importantly, as a derivative, as the tongue of Rome and, more importantly, as the tongue of its heirs, Latin became in the Middle Ages the language of science, of learning, of rhetoric, and of poetry, but more importantly, a language of imperium and of supersession, the language of the Christian church, triumphant. And in all of these senses, Latin followed a very distinct pattern, established before the predominance of Christianity, of being a language of opposition within a wider world of competing language communities. Classical Latin's competition against the prestige of classical Greek as a language of culture and philosophy was repeated in a new mode in the early Middle Ages by ecclesiastical Latin's competition with the prestige of Hebrew as a holy language. And this later gave way to a clerical competition against the prestige and status of Arabic as a language of learning and science, against also the encroaching written vernaculars that became languages of poetry. So over the millennium following Augustine's defense of the authority of the Greek scripture, the Greek Septuagint, when Latin later became a de facto Western language, the authority of Latin as a language of worship, of poetry, of learning, and of science would be challenged over and over again through multiple stages, first of vernacularization and directly through competition with Arabic, which, as we can see, became a dominant language of learning and cultural prestige in the Mediterranean after the 9th century. So when the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, did his little linguistic experiment on these poor babies, he naturally wondered if Latin or Greek or Arabic might be their inborn language, because these had been paired together in competition for many centuries already. Setting aside Arabic for the moment, we'll come to that later in the talk, we can see that the connection of Latin with Hebrew and Greek harkens back to a patristic notion of the three languages of the cross, in which Jesus allegedly was mocked as King of the Jews, as it tells us in John chapter 19. Although first elaborated in the writing of Hilary of Poitiers, this notion of the three languages of the cross was quickly taken up by Augustine, for whom Latin appeared on the cross, he says, on account of the Romans who ruled many, and at that time virtually all the nations, and on account of the church which came to rule everyone. In the patristic tradition to which Augustine thus gives voice, Latin is the newest and the least prestigious of these holy languages, but it's also, more importantly, the rightful heir, the keeper of its illustrious forebears. And on the basis of this formulation, Latin would be seen throughout the Middle Ages as the ruler, the empress, both worldly and spiritual, of all other tongues and nations. We can see a kind of example of this thinking in 9 centuries after Augustine in the writing of Guillaume Durand, the 13th century bishop of Mende in southern France. He describes this very familiar liturgical scene from the church practice in his Reasons of the Divine Office. He says, after prayers, the priest carries the veiled cross to the right of the altar. The priest then sings in Hebrew, as if in the role of the Savior, and the word for role is in persona. The acolytes then sing Agios o Theos, Holy God, in Greek, as if in the role of the Greeks, and the choir responds, Sanctus Sanctus, Holy Holy, as if in the role of the Latins. And here, just as each language is represented, and more importantly, dramatized, enacted, by individual voices of the priest, the acolytes, and the chorus, respectively, so each language represents a figure in human history. Thus God is praised, he says, in 3 languages, namely Hebrew, which by law is the mother of all languages, and Greek, which is the teacher, and Latin, which is the empress, on account of the dominion of the Roman Empire and of the papacy. And this word empress, imperatrix, could be compared to some other form, more like dominatrix. Latin, like Hebrew and Greek, is one of the holy languages of Christian worship, but it also plays a specific role in the history of the church. Just as Hebrew is the mother and Greek is the teacher, so Latin is the empress, the dominatrix of all, by virtue of the hegemony of the Roman Empire and of its heir, the papacy. And this tradition of seeing Latin as one of the 3 languages of the cross was actually an effective countermeasure to the very low place conceded to all languages except Hebrew by the Genesis account of the fall of man and the confusion at the Tower of Babel. Latin, along with virtually all languages, could not compete against the preeminent prestige of Hebrew as omnium linguarum mater, the mother of all languages, the only language uncorrupted by original sin. As the 12th century writer Petrus Comestor, or Peter the Eater, likes to say and repeats, which was really a very widespread tradition, when God created things, he says, Adam gave them names in the Hebrew language, which was the only one at first, unquote. It was only after the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel that other languages were born. The tradition dating back to at least the 2nd century church father Irenaeus specifies that when the Tower of Babel crumbled, 72 languages resulted from the chaos. And from the rubble of this building, the diversity of nations was also born. 7th century Iberian saint Isidore sums up in his encyclopedic book the categories or etymologies, what was already by his time a well-established tradition. He says, the diversity of languages arose with the building of the Tower of Babel after the flood. Before the pride of that tower divided human society into different sounds of signs, there was one language of all nations, which was called Hebrew. Many languages arose from one language. And the division of languages here is connected with the population of the world by the 3 sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Jephthah, who came to occupy Asia, Africa, and Europe, respectively, in the medieval T&O map, which you can see here. And to understand this map, you have to turn it on its side and see that north is this way. So Europe is here, the Mediterranean is in the middle, Africa is below, and Asia to the east is on top. And everything around it is simply ocean. This idea was repeated almost verbatim by the Frankish monk Rabanus Maurus, and it was developed by many later writers from the 12th to the 15th century, writers including Andrew of St. Victor, Rodriguez Jimenez de Rada in Spain, and Lucas of Tuy. Over and over again, these theories place Latin in a very undistinguished position relative to Hebrew as a language of revelation. As Guillaume Durand bluntly puts it, the Hebrew language is the most noble of all languages, the most noble mother of all languages, on account of the authority of divine scripture. But Latin is inferior like a daughter. Indeed, we can remember that Frederick proposed that the infant's languages might well be Hebrew because, as Salim Beni tells us, it was the first language. And based on this early patristic tradition, the idea persisted up to the late 13th century that Latin, like all languages except Hebrew, was the product of God confounding man's hubris and did not share in the supreme authority of Adam's language, the first language of all. Scholastic Christian writers in the 13th century at the early universities extended this idea by praising Hebrew not only as the original pre-lapsarian language, but also as a more precise and more perfect language of concrete realism. The Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas praised Adam, he says, because in giving Hebrew names to all things in Genesis, he recognized fully the nature of things. So to trump Hebrew's prerogative as the only language to actually precede man's fall, later ecclesiastical writers, like Augustine, invoked the New Testament event of Pentecost, as told in Acts of the Apostles, when, after the resurrection of Jesus, men of all nations and tongues understood each other, even though they spoke differently. This comprehension of many tongues was later said to be the counterpoint to the chaos of Babel, just as the rising of Christ in Christian reading is the counterpoint to the fall of Adam. And at the same time, although earthly Latin was more often relegated to the status of a distant epigon relative to Hebrew, this second-rate status was really nothing new. In classical antiquity, we can remember Latin was repeatedly characterized as an impoverished language next to Greek. But this little trope of Latin's alleged inferiority in both antique and medieval cases actually contains within it a tacit claim to inheritance and even superiority. The first-century Roman philosopher Lucretius praised Greek on the one hand as having a more varied vocabulary than Latin, but at the same time he implied that, for that very reason, it was more confused and obscure and effeminate, a language of big words and fuzzy thinking, not a manly language like Latin. Similarly, medieval writers who invoked the status of Latin as a belated language of revelation could invert this idea to Latin's benefit by invoking the final supersession of Greek wisdom and Hebrew truth within the Latin tradition of the Western Church. So, as in belief, so in language, as Jesus taught, the last shall be first. Latin's ability to imperiously absorb the prestige of other rival languages found apt expression in metaphors of war and conquest. Writers were fond of evoking this perennial topos of the beautiful woman stolen in war in the book of Deuteronomy, the prize of conquest, who became a metaphor for Christian reading in Jewish scripture. She was a slave girl stolen in war, and just as she had to be, according to Deuteronomy, shaved of all her hair and have all of her nails clipped and her clothing changed before she could be impregnated and kept as a wife. So the attractive verses of the Hebrew Bible had to be trimmed and shorn of their alterity by an allegorical Christian reading. For the 12th century abbot Baldric of Bourgueil, this taking of Jewish booty, as it were, was also the triumph of Latin over Hebrew and Greek. He says, "The whole world speaks as if with one tongue. So let the Latin language be enriched by enemy booty, and let the vanquished Greek and Hebrew serve." So much for the Christian view of its place relative to Hebrew and Greek. What did the Jews think of Latin and of such claims? It should come as no surprise that these attempts by Christians to claim the status of Latin as a universal and revelatory language of reunification did not go unchallenged by Jewish writers. In the late antique work of halakhic or legal exegesis called Sifrei Dvarim, Sifrei Deuteronomy, it claims that God, quote, revealed himself to humans not in one language but in four, in Hebrew, in Latin, in Arabic, and Aramaic. And yet the text says all the Gentile nations are like dogs who can't carry a burden, while Israel is a sturdy ass that can carry its own load plus that of all of the dirty dogs. Thus Hebrew is the only language of the four that's able to carry the full burden of God's revelation to Moses. Similarly, medieval Christian texts also attacked the Christian view of authority very close to its root by characterizing the Latin language itself as unfit to be a vehicle of revelation. In his Hebrew work from the 14th century, Shulchan Kesef, or Table of Silver, 14th century southern French philosopher Joseph ibn Caspi recounts a debate he says he had with a bishop over the relative merits of Hebrew and Latin languages. He says, "Once a bishop honored in our country who was versed in the Holy Scriptures asked me, what superiority and sanctity have the Hebrew language and writing over the language of Rome and writing, since the meaning is intended in both Hebrew and Latin remains the same? My answer was, the writing of our books written in Hebrew is the script of God, and it is in this tongue that they were given. If a king gives us a letter of freedom, and if he writes it with his own hand and in our own tongue, it would be more precious to us than anything else. Our books are written in the language of the king. Secondly," he says, "the meaning intended by the metaphors has been changed in Latin and has so deteriorated in a number of passages that they cannot be understood even by the one who made them, God. The book of Moses, translated into another language and written in another language, is not at all the book given to us by God." Unquote. Ibn Caspi even then quotes Genesis in Latin, but writes it in Hebrew characters in order to show that the language of Christians lacks the double sense intended by God in the Hebrew original. Even if it serves as a language of translation, it lacks the capacity for the plenitude of God's original revelation. In Hebrew, Latin goes unnamed and is simply referred to as Leshon Romi, the language of Rome, or La'az, just a foreign language of any kind, a term that can include both Latin and Latinate vernacular. Arguments like Ibn Caspi can be understood as responses to the persistent attempts by Christians to construct an authority for Latin as a supersessionist language of reunification, a language that inherits all of the holiness of the past, a language within which are gathered the scattered fragments of truth left over from a lost Eden, the Eden of the Hebraica Veritas, or Hebrew truth. Let's return to Frederick II's grisly experiment and his poor dead babies. In his description of it, Salim Bene also mentions, along Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, the possibility that these babies speak some language of their parents from whom they were born. Do these languages have names? In Frederick's region, and throughout what would later be France and Spain and Italy and Portugal, the names of such spoken languages were slow to emerge. Before the decisive moments, which varied by each location, when written Latin acquired a metalinguistic status as a language apart from its dialects or its spoken forms, rather than remaining what we might call a single version on a spectrum of diglossia, or different registers within one language with a high and a low register. Before all of this, a systematic terminology to distinguish the unlettered spoken forms of these poor parents and the learned written form within which Salim Bene writes his account emerged only gradually and sometimes didn't emerge at all. In the case of Iberia, it's especially instructive, where words distinguishing spoken and written forms of Ibero-Romance, or spoken forms of Romance languages in Iberia, first appear only around 1100, when written Latin came to be called Latin, and Latino or Latino continued as words meaning Romance or spoken Latin. A parallel double usage exists in Occitan and in Old French, in which the phrase en son latin, which appears widely to mean in his vernacular or in his own jargon, can also be found in the same texts even to mean in Latin, in his own Latin. It's interesting to note that such French texts use this term en latin, and it can easily mean the babbling in any unknown language, not just Latin, and in fact is used to describe the warbling of birds who speak in their own Latin. And this always makes me think of Virginia Woolf, who always insisted that the birds spoke to her in Greek, not Latin. In any case, they're not speaking my language. In Iberia, we can see as late as 1492 the survival of the word Ladino as a multi-use term to denote both Latin and Romance languages, such as in the Latin Castilian dictionary of Antonio Nebrija. The usage of the word Ladino a form of Latino or Latin to mean Romance speech based on Latin, would partly survive among Sephardic Jews who were exiled from Spain, who continued to speak and write a form of Judeo-Spanish, which is still called by many today Ladino. And in fact, Thursday after next, a week from tomorrow, there's a talk by Monique Balbuena about the writing of Ladino among modern authors, mostly in Latin America. As medieval Mediterranean Jews failed to make a firm distinction between written Latin and spoken Romance forms, calling them vaguely the language of Rome or Ladino or Laaz, medieval speakers of Arabic in Spain, in al-Andalus, Muslim Iberia, employed a similar mixed use of terms that were both imprecise and confusing. In Andalusi Arabic, these words, Latini in Arabic or Latiniya, could refer to spoken forms and written forms of the same language, some Latin language that was undistinguished. Although most references are to spoken Ibero-Romance, they could also include written Latin. 11th century writer Ibn Hazm describes a very interesting situation. He tells of a lost enclave of an ancient Arabian tribe, the Bali tribe, living north of Cordoba, and about them says, they cannot speak this language, Latiniya, very well, but only speak Arabic. And this is true both of their women folk and of their men folk. And here the term Latiniya, or Latinia, was commonly used to denote spoken Ibero-Romance. Ibn Hazm uses the very same term to mean Latin. What's most interesting about his story is that he implies that most people can speak this Latiniya, and that especially women know how to speak it. This lack of distinction in his writing and in other Arabic texts between spoken and written forms of Latin and Romance among non-Christians, which is really at its core implies a lack of authoritative prestige of written Latin by just about everyone except for Christians, is especially apparent in another anecdote recounted about a century after Ibn Hazm by the Jewish poet from Spain, Moses ibn Ezra, in which he recounts a linguistic rivalry between Hebrew and Arabic that has turned into a common opposition to this Christian language, Latini. He tells the story in Arabic, Judeo-Arabic actually. He says, when I was a young man in my native land, Granada, I was once asked by a great Islamic scholar of law, of fiqh, who was well versed in the religious disciplines of Islam and most kind towards me, to recite the 10 Commandments for him in Arabic. I realized his intention. He in fact wanted to belittle the quality of their language. So I asked him to recite the first surah, the Fatiha of his Quran in al-Latini, a language he could speak and understand very well. When he tried to render the Fatiha, the opening verse of the Quran, in the above-mentioned language, it sounded ugly and completely distorted. He noticed what was in my mind and didn't press me further to fulfill his request. And although in this passage the author clearly refers to some form of spoken Ibero-Romance, he puts this language in contention with the classical languages of Scripture, a logical role played by Latin, not by spoken forms of Romance. Other 12th century Arabic texts by both Jews and Muslims make little conceptual distinction between Romance, spoken Romance, and written Latin as actually separate languages. And if such a distinction is at all recognized, such as in multilingual listings of plants or medicinal herbs or body parts in medical treatises, even there it's not maintained in a systematic way. So among non-Christian intellectuals, Latin was until very late considered to be a commonly spoken and thus maternal or not non-paternal language, and it only began to slough off this accrued infamy after the 12th century. By the 12th century, even when Latin did gain a measure of respect, the rising authority of Latin as a written language was directly challenged, immediately challenged, by competition from other written languages of learning, above all Arabic. And Salim Beni de Adam, we can remember, included Arabic among his list of written languages that might emerge from these atavistic tendencies of his poor, untrained infants. At the very moment that Salim Beni writes his description in the late 13th century, a willful blow was being dealt to Latin's authority in the Iberian Peninsula with the ambitious projects of the Castilian king, Alfonso X, the Wise. He was a younger contemporary of Frederick II, and he not only took steps to elevate the status of the Castilian dialect above other Romance dialects, he also explicitly worked to edge out Latin as an official language in his kingdom through use of Castilian for legal and historiographical writing, and even as a language of his chancery. The ramifications of such policies on the construction of the imperium in Alfonso's reign are nowhere more evident than on the tomb that Alfonso had constructed for his father, Fernando III, which eventually his father conquered from the Muslims of Seville and converted the mosque into this cathedral. And the tomb lay in the mosque until it was converted into the new cathedral, which this monument now bears on each of its four sides an inscription in one of the languages of Alfonso's kingdom, in Hebrew, in Arabic, in Latin, and in Castilian. So on the back side of what you see here are the other two languages. And all of them praise Fernando in the same, basically the same text, the one who conquered all of Spain. In monuments like these, physically as well as symbolically, Latin is made to share a crowded stage next to this vernacular Castilian as one of the official languages of the kingdom. This monument, however, evinces even more than the erosion of Latin as a language of empire in Alfonso's reign. It also signals, more importantly, the competition of both Latin and its vernaculars with Hebrew and Arabic. Alfonso patronized numerous translations from Arabic to Castilian, and the choice to bypass Latin was a deliberate attempt to stand apart from the earlier Arabic to Latin translation works of the preceding century, including those translation works by Frederick II. In contrast with the ambitious translating endeavors of the 12th century, which really infused the Latin language with a new vitality as a viable language of learning for the first time, Alfonso's 13th century translations into Castilian, along with his lyric production in Galician Portuguese, enacted what we can see as a double-pronged challenge to Latin's authority as a language of learning in Western Christendom and as a language of literary poetic expression. Alfonso's interest in translating works of Castilian works into Castilian from Arabic and not from Latin reflects an ongoing, more widespread standing of Arabic over Latin as a preeminent language of thought, of science, and of technology across the entire Mediterranean. But it also intimates the inherent valence of Arabic as a language of empire, of political prowess, one that had unified a contiguous band of people and culture stretching from Iberia to India, virtually since the 8th century. The sophistication and size and of the centers of learning across this Islamic world dwarfed in size just about every other center of learning that peppered Western Latinity. This Islamic wealth derived from a syncretism of Greek sources and traditional Persian material, along with Sanskrit texts that were all absorbed through Middle Persian into Arabic, also called Middle Persian, also Sasanian Pahlavi. All of it translated into Arabic and brought into Iberia. And all of this dwarfed the riches, the few and meager riches of the Christian centers of learning in Iberia and in France. The rise of Latin into the form of an authoritative language of scholasticism and science in the later Middle Ages depended on the infusion into Latin through translation of this deep concentration of wealth in Arabic sources. And the anxiety produced within Latin culture by the Muslim conquest of North Africa and of most of Iberia at the dawn of the 8th century slowly evolved into a marked ambivalence over the meaning of Arabic learning and the use of Arabic technology, especially by the 10th century. This presence of Arabic, which we could see as a sort of specter that hovers perpetually across the entire southern border of Latinity and slowly and occasionally wafts into it, this force of Arabic became a source of both polemical attack and of fantasy, and later a reference point of self-evaluation for Christian Latin speakers. In the 9th century, the Iberian bishop Paul Alvarez wrote a famous lament for the poor knowledge of Latin among the youth of his day, who were all smitten with the sexy grammar of Arabic poetry and of dress, and were becoming increasingly ignorant of Latin. Who, he wails, is found among our faithful laymen, who's skillful enough to understand the book of Holy Scripture, or anything in Latin, by any of our doctors? Alas, what pain! The Christians no longer know their law. The Latins no longer pay attention to their own language, so then that in the whole college of Christ, hardly 1 in 1,000 can be found who reasonably is able to write a letter of greeting to his brother, while one finds uncountable throngs of those who explain with erudition Arabic displays of words. Alvarez wrote this lament in response to a situation peculiar to the Christians living in Muslim al-Andalus, but it's paradigmatic of a broader, albeit less well-articulated, Christian anxiety about Islam and about the Arabic language that spread far beyond Iberia. Although, except in places like this, 9th and 10th century Cordoba, or 11th century Palermo, or 12th century Toledo, Arabic actually yielded little direct threat as a temptation away from Latin. It still remained a presence, an ineluctable, unsettling presence of foreignness on the horizon of Latinity. And in the process of internalizing and essentially domesticating this foreignness through translation into 12th and 13th centuries, Latinity acquired an awareness both of its own limitations and of its place within a wide world of competing notions of authority. One very telling example of this process of an internalization of foreignness, an appropriation of a foreign identity, that accompany this increased awareness of the authoritative prestige of Arabic can be found in a detail in the 12th century translation of the Quran into Latin, really the first translation of the Quran into any language, undertaken by Robert of Ketton in Toledo at the behest of the French abbot Peter the Venerable. And here's a manuscript from this first translation, and in fact this is a famous folio because you can see at the bottom this little drawing, which we can see in detail, actually depicts Muhammad as a fish. In this Latin translation, in verse 41, we can find a specific detail that tells us of the prestige of Arabic over Latin, even in the mind of the translators of the Quran. In verse 41-44, which addresses the importance of the Arabic language as a medium for God's words, God asks, if we sent down a Quran in a foreign language, ajamiya, they would have said, how can there be a foreign language and an Arab speaker? In the Quran, this word for a foreign language, ajamiya, is translated by Ketton specifically as Latin, who adapts this whole verse slightly. He says, if we had written it in Latin, he would have asked why Latin and Arabic letters are not distinguished. This word choice in this tiny detail is made again in the early 13th century in the second translation of the Quran into Latin by Mark of Toledo, and again is quoted in the 14th century by the English theologian and dissenter John Wycliffe. The choice to translate ajamiya, a foreign language, as specifically Latin, followed a translation that was evident as far back as the 10th century among Arabic Christians in al-Andalus, where the characterization of speakers of Romance was as non-Arab foreigners, as ajam. But its use by Iberian Christians in the 12th century, and especially by these translators of the Quran, reflects an internalization on the part of all of these people working in different moments of the relative conceptual place of Latin and the perspective of its revelation, of the revelation of God in Arabic. Even as these writers criticized the Quran over and over again in polemics, both Mark and Robert translated this word in the same way, recognizing essentially the formidable concept of authority that came along with the Arabic language itself. And as writers like Thomas Berman have shown, Robert of Ketton actually took steps to imitate and evoke a particularly elevated Latin style in order, he says, to render the solemn eloquence of the Quran's language. The basis of this sense of authority in Arabic, as both of these translators knew, rested principally on the Quran itself, which was and is still considered among Muslims not simply to be a vehicle for divine expression, but essentially a miracle in itself, an exalted language that no man can equal or outdo. The status of Arabic within Islam is inseparable from the belief that God, the God of Abraham worshipped by Jews, Christians, and Muslims, repeatedly handed down this message in his will, through his message, over and over to the prophets, including Moses and Jesus. The subsequent corruption and confusion of this same message by both Jews and Christians necessitated the final revelation of Islam in, as it says in Book 15, a clear Quran, and again in the clear Arabic language, as it says in Book 26. The Arabic language thus lays claim to an unparalleled uniqueness as being in itself a sort of theophany, a worldly manifestation of divine power and will, preserved in a pure and transparent state. The view of Islam, in Islam, of the Quran as the very words of God exist among believers from the very beginning of its revelation in 610 and quickly becomes a universal belief among Muslims. This really contrasts sharply with the slow development of the Jewish belief in Hebrew as Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language, a doctrine that's not at all evident in the biblical canon and that only seems to emerge gradually later in Hellenistic Jewish culture. The 2nd century BCE Book of Jubilees contains the earliest reference to Hebrew explicitly as a divine language, the original language of creation taught to Adam by God. Only in the rabbinical and medieval periods was Hebrew actually adopted and universally recognized as a holy language of creation, revelation, and eventually mystical reflection, in addition to ritual and liturgy. So in contrast to these languages, in contrast to Hebrew and Greek and Latin, which despite their usage were only gradually and belatedly actually defined by their users as holy languages, Arabic laid claim to an immediate prestige within Islamic society as the preeminent holy language, a belief that was virtually synonymous with universal belief in Muhammad and his prophecy, and that emerged from the very beginning of Islam. Arabic's prestige can also be contrasted to a language like Sanskrit, which originated as a language of sacred ritual and sacrifice, but very restricted to an elite Brahmin class, and only 1,000 years later, it seems, burst spontaneously across South Asia as a language first of literary culture and then of government. So as the spread of Islam, especially across North Africa, was as much, if not more, a political process as it was a religious one, this prestige of the Arabic language naturally established it as the most suitable imperial language as well as the most suitable divine language. Antonio de Nebrija's famous assertion about language in his Grammar of the Castilian Language, the first grammar really of any Romance vernacular, and published not insignificantly in 1492, claims, quote, "Language has always been the companion of empire, la compañera del imperio." And this is nowhere more true in the Middle Ages than in the case of Arabic. And even as the use of Arabic quickly permeated other spheres in Islam, such as government and literature, the Quran was always esteemed among Muslims as the standard benchmark of linguistic authority. The simultaneous spread of Arabic culture and of Islam itself quickly produced a natural division between these many spoken forms of Arabic dialects, called the Amiyat, in each region, and one single standard language of writing and formal expression, now known as Fusha, modeled according to these earlier sources of authority. This classic structure of diglossia, in which there are different registers within one language, which still persists today, characterizes Fusha as the natural heir of the combined prestige of this Quranic revelation and of the purportedly natural language of the pre-Islamic nomadic Bedouins, the greatest poets of early Islam. The definition and preservation of a pure classical Arabic, a process not entirely separable from the standardization of the Quran itself after the death of Muhammad under the third Caliph Uthman, was really one of the major endeavors of early Islamic and essentially of all medieval civilization. And it produced the names of some 4,000 Arabic grammarians between the years 750 and 1500. And most importantly, this standardization of Arabic represented the fulfillment of the mandate handed down in Holy Revelation itself. Now, in this context of the elevated status of Arabic as a supreme language of revelation, a language in which God finally chose to speak directly to all people, other languages could hardly figure as important, let alone valuable. In the 9th century writing of the Cordoban jurist Ibn Habib, he claims that there are really only 3 prophetic languages, Arabic, Hebrew, and Syriac, and makes no mention of Greek or Latin. His argument is all the more cutting because it's proffered by an Iberian Muslim for whom this Latiniya, the language of the Christians, was a very proximate reality. Among Eastern Muslims, ignorance of Latin and of Latinate Romance was so obvious it was a matter of course. The only direct reference at all to Latin as a written language found in any medieval Arabic source in the East is by the 10th century bibliographer Ibn al-Nadim. He sets out in his catalog, or fihrist, to classify the most important writers of his day, both Arabic and non-Arabic. And he lists the languages of this text and lists a total of 16 languages, only 3 of which seem to refer vaguely to Western Christendom. Languages he calls Greek, Frankish, and some other writing of the Lombards and Saxons. Latin is not at all mentioned by name, but he tells an interesting anecdote which might be about Latin. He tells a story taken from an earlier source about the arrival of an emissary from one Queen Bertha of Rome to Baghdad in 906, bearing a letter that was written, quote, in a language, a writing resembling the Greek script, but more straight. And when no one at the court was found who could know this language or read it, they found a Frank who was working in a clothing store owned by a eunuch who could translate it into Greek for someone to understand. So to a large degree, what little was known about Western Latinity in the Abbasid East of Islam was just confused with Byzantium, the Greek Christian East, lumped together under one big title, the land of the Rum, or the Romans. This generic term was used in the East to refer to Christians in general and Byzantines in particular, and sometimes in Iberia to Iberian Christians. And this same usage appears specifically among Byzantine Jews, for whom Leshon Romi meant Greek, not Latin, and Latin essentially does not exist with a name. Arabic sources, like Hebrew sources, display a general disdain for the language and learning of these Rum, often in contradistinction to the more illustrious ancient Yunan, the Ionians or ancient Greeks. And with a few rare exceptions, which can be found in Western Arabic sources from Spain, the Latin language in general, and Latin culture in particular, were so unimportant as to seem non-existent in Eastern Arabic sources. The relative unimportance and total lack of authority of Latin in virtually any Arabophone worldview, and this is both Muslim and Jewish, East or West, was not lost on these Latin scholars of the 12th and 13th centuries. Roger Bacon saw Latin's very low place in the world as a call to learning, to learn the languages from which, he says, all knowledge of the Latins is in some way translated, which are Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. This need to read translated works was all the more pressing because, he says, Latin was also comparatively poor in vocabulary. Translators, he says, do not find enough vocabulary in the Latin language. Moreover, he says, the Latins have not even composed a single text, that is, neither of theology nor of philosophy. Bacon argued that Hebrew, along with Arabic, was in fact the only primitive vessel, the primitivum vas, from which Latin scholars might draft their elixir of special learning, if they were to compete at all with non-Latin traditions of science. So as texts of Arabic learning, of literature and revelation began to be translated into Latin in the 12th century, Latin scholars were repeatedly faced not only with Arabic's unanswerable claims to divine authority, but also with the reality of the vast wealth absorbed into Arabic sources over the first centuries of Islam and preserved in the Abbasid Caliphate. The ascendance of Latin as a language of learning, of science, and of wisdom eventually depended on the usurpation, the forceful usurpation of Arabic's prestige through translation and imitation in 12th and 13th century Latin sources. The nature of this change can be gauged in a nutshell by especially regarding the increasing respect commanded by Latin among non-Christian intellectuals. The 14th century sociologist Ibn Khaldun, in updating Ibn al-Nadim's summary of scripts and languages, which he included in his Muqaddimah, now includes Latin as a language worth noting, and claims that it is actually one of the few languages, along with Arabic, Hebrew, and Syriac, that's even worth discussing. Latin finally makes his list now, because he says, quote, the intellectual sciences, although they had been shunned by the Romans when they became Christian, Latin has again in his time become a language of learning and wisdom. He says, we further hear now that the philosophical sciences are greatly cultivated in the land of Rome and along the adjacent northern shore of the country of the European Christians. They are said to be studied there again and taught in numerous classes, unquote. A similar rise in Latin status can be seen among Jewish intellectuals in the later Middle Ages. By the 15th century, Jews living under Christian rule in Castile and Aragon no longer regarded Arabic as the exclusive and de facto language of thought. The 15th century Hebrew poet Solomon Bonafede praises and recommends to his students what he calls the straight path in the art of the Latin language, while at the same time he can criticize what he calls the Christian belief as a path of death. And even centuries after the time of Frederick II and his linguistic experiment, the authority of the Latin language remained tied to its Arabic legacy. Despite this final flourishing of Latin as an authoritative language of wisdom and science in the later Middle Ages and eventually into the early Renaissance, Arabic continued to hold a lingering prestige among Latin speakers long after being eclipsed in actuality as a Western language of translation. In the middle of the 14th century, a Dominican, Alfonso X, proffered a pair of Christian texts, pro-Christian texts, that he called the Epistle of Rabbi Samuel and the Dispute of Abu Talib, the former of which was actually destined to become among the most widely circulated texts against Jews in the later Middle Ages, and was printed repeatedly in the first 100 years of printing. In a statement found in the prologue to both texts, which is actually identical, Alphonsus claims, and this is very dubious if we judge by the content, that he did not actually write the text himself. He merely translated what he calls this very little old book, which quite by chance came into my hands and was hidden for so long in the past, in a new translation from Arabic to Latin. And already, even by his time in the 14th century, Arabic had ceased being the preeminent language of learning in the Western Mediterranean. Arabic could still be evoked as a framing device for the Latin text, providing a whiff of venerability and authority by virtue of its symbolic currency with past learning. Examples of such framing appear as late as the memorable rendition of Cervantes in 1605, claiming that Don Quixote was the first work that he translated out of Arabic, an Arabic work of a Muslim author. Such tropes, he says, attest to the enduring prestige of Arabic even in the 15th and 16th centuries, when it enjoyed a rich afterlife as an imagined language of knowledge and authority at a time when medieval Latin was increasingly derided and scorned as a foil of early modern humanism. Thank you.
Okay, I would ask a question. I actually have a couple of questions. One's a sort of a simple, basic question. The term ifranj, used in Arabic to refer to Latin and or Romance. Do you ever find that in Iberian sources?
No, not that I know of. Unless they're sources, they're not Iberian sources. They're only Crusader sources that happen to make it into Iberia. But sources written in Iberia, I can't think of any that use the word ifranj, meaning Franks, right? The Franks.
Right. Yeah.
To refer to Latin or none come to mind. Yeah. But certainly the texts that used it were in Iberia, but I can't think of any Iberian authors that would have used that term.
No, because you had a slide that said Latinia was the word used in Arabic to refer to Latin, which is, you know, I think that it's found in later sources and maybe in Iberian sources in general. But in the Eastern Mediterranean, the term used for Latin is typically, it's like the language of those Western Christians is typically Ifranj.
Well, we have to distinguish between before and after Crusade, right? So the earliest texts that talk about Latin at all don't use the word Ifranj at all. They start out with the term Latinia, or not any term at all. They just describe it vaguely. And it's very much a crusading context that creates the Franks, right, as the representatives.
Uses, well before the Crusades, uses the term Ifranj to refer to.
That's probably the first example that you could come up with. But it becomes incredibly dominant. Like, that's the term after, I would say after the 1150s maybe. I mean, that's... But it really, the truth is that they're talking ethnically. They're not talking about the names of languages.
Yeah.
They just lump them all together.
Yeah.
So the people were certainly talked about, but the languages that they spoke or that they wrote were not.
Yeah.
So there really is no reference to Latin as a written language. And it's not called anything. I mean, it doesn't exist, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the important thing to remember, that it's not that the people, I mean, they knew that they existed and they knew they were even around and they had names for them, but their language was not given a name. I mean, Frankish, that's pretty much what, like in this list of Ibn Nadim, that's one of the names, right? Frankish.
Right.
But it doesn't mean Latin in this context. It probably means a spoken version of French or something, Old French, some kind of Franco-Romance.
Well, I think in the Eastern Arabic sources, my impression is that it means whatever language it takes to get business done with these Western Christians.
Yeah.
You don't really care what words you're using, but it's that language that you use among, you know, in order to communicate with them.
They also use the term, like in Hebrew, Lashon Romi, or some form of, you know, some version of this, the tongue of the Romans.
But that means regularly in the
Vaguely.
Eastern Arabic sources, it regularly means Byzantine.
Right, it comes to mean Byzantine specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I've never seen it used to mean Latin Christian or Western Christian.
Not in the East, only in the West.
Yeah.
But it's the same term that gets used in both places. It's a very specific Byzantine context. So it's used by both Jews and Muslims in a Greek-speaking milieu to mean Greek, because Latin doesn't exist, right? It's not. It has no. It has no presence. So it's not just that they had two names and one of them was for Greek and one for Latin. They essentially had no name for Latin as a written language of, you know, of text, right? They had these vague names for dialects spoken by these people. So it's this prestige of language as a language of learning, or of as a classical, essentially a paternal language rather than a maternal language. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the article on language and translation of Bernard Lewis that we read to prepare for your lecture. He presents a view really that states Arabic scholars look down upon the European languages for many years. Is that a widely accepted view in the Arab world, or is he again kind of on the outside of public opinion in this matter?
I think, as far as I understand the sources, that's very true. There was virtually no prestige for Christian languages among Arabic-speaking people unless they were Christian, and even they didn't really know. There's no sense that these languages exist. So, in general, there was a disdain, but it was even more than just an active polemical disdain. It was really a lack of interest, a lack of concern. And so he talks a lot about cases, especially in the 16th century and beyond, when there is a lot of contact through Turkish and sort of a separate chapter of this history. And even then, there's still a disdain for these sources. So I wouldn't say that's a fringe view at all. I think that I would totally accept that view. There are obviously individual exceptions, but overall, the presence of Latin as a language of learning is first ignored, unknown, and eventually, when it's known, disdained. I mean, it's really an issue of competition. It's not until much, much later, maybe, I couldn't even put a date, this is getting beyond things I know about, but maybe the 18th century, when there actually starts to be a sense of prestige associated with these Christian Western languages. So I think that Lewis is actually very, very useful. And I mean, it's shocking almost because you're not used to thinking of it this way, but I don't think that he's expressing an unorthodox view at all. And I think he tells even this story of this text of Bertha, the letter of Bertha, which is truly like the only source we have, certainly the first source, that he mentions anything close to what we can call the written language of the Christians from the West, which has to be some kind of Latin. It's coming from Rome, so. The interesting thing about Lewis, to say one more thing, is that he does extend it into the modern period. So I think the Turkish context, which Professor Hagen will talk about more next week, I think, is really an interesting period of transition. There's much more contact, I would say, under that, and so you get a wider variety and a more quickly changing view. So we can keep all the things that I sort of raised in mind for next week, or whenever he speaks, because I think that the things from the Lewis article will come back. A lot of this Turkish material will reappear specifically, and it gets to be this kind of interesting idolization of Turkey in Western sources. So it's no longer the Arabic language as a language of learning, but of Turkey as a land of riches or something. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, with the picture that you had of the tomb of Ferdinand III having those 4 languages on it, it seems that one has to spend quite some resources to inscribe pieces of language, and those seem to have taken up kind of the same amount of space and things like that on the tomb.
Mm-hmm.
So visually they would seem that they were all given some amount of worthwhileness, or they were all thought of somehow important to praise that king. What might have led to that in that particular time and place, instead of the languages being seen in competition? And if they were in competition, then you would think that one would have taken up more prominence or had more resources expended on it, making an inscription.
Well, I think that the thing that strikes me about that monument is that you could expect just Latin and nothing more, or maybe Latin and Castilian. So to include Hebrew and Arabic, especially Hebrew, is really this gesture of imperial arrogance, to claim that he's ruling all of these people in their languages. He's the receiver of all of this. So it's a tricky kind of double gesture. It's not that he wants to erase all of this and exclude it, but be the controller, right? The receiver or the inheritor. And his translation projects are really about this, right? Claiming this prestige. And it's not just in texts, but in all of his different policies, the way he, I think, cultivated his image and his style. And he had ambitions to be Holy Roman Emperor too. He does it by imitation, right? By usurpation, by this kind of mimesis that's directly a power gamble. So I think that by including these languages, it's not that we can see them as getting respect. I think it's that they're all under, his banner. And in fact, it's to celebrate. They talk about him celebrating they talk about his father celebrating the conquest of all of Spain. So the implication is directly that he's the ruler of all of these languages and peoples. So it's a very interesting monument, though, because of that, right? It's commemorating his father's triumph, but also that it gets such a long-lasting history. It's even depicted in illuminations in his own manuscripts of the cantigas, his songs. So you can see like versions of his own representation, which are put in the context of songs about the Virgin Mary giving miraculous power to his father to finish the reconquest of Spain. So it's part of this sort of myth of his father. But you have to remember that to have control of these languages, including them, wasn't a kind gesture. It was a gesture of self-promotion, really. Other questions?
question because I'm curious about it. I love it when people personify languages, like represent languages as people, like, you know, the evil stepmother and Cinderella.
Yeah.
But you didn't have any images for Arabic, really, right? Did any of those images were not meant to represent the Arabic language? There was Hebrew and
Yeah.
Latin and
I would if I had to depict Arabic, I'd make him the prince. Prince Charming, who comes in and essentially takes her to the dance.
Awesome. Okay. That answers my question. Absolutely. Does anybody else have questions for Professor Szpiech before are you really ready to let him off the hook that easily? Okay, if there are no more questions, then I think we'll thank you one more time for.
Thank you.